back to those conflicts, really conflicts plural, in the Middle East. There's Iraq and there's Gaza and Israel. We have heard dueling accusations about bias, and in recent weeks on this program, we've talked about what has been said by both sides. But what about the bias that comes from what's not said? What about bias by omission? This was raised by Crossfire co-host S.E. Cupp in a recent op-ed. So to start the show this morning, she joins me here along with James Zogby, the president of the Arab American Institute. Thank you both for being here. S.E., let me start with you first. You say that when this conflict is covered, there's sometimes a giant glaring omission. So what is it?
Yeah, and it's not sometimes. It's often. It's par for the course. In discussing the demands that Hamas has in the negotiations with Israel, most reporters omit the fact that Hamas's stated main priority, its main objective, is the total destruction of Israel and the annihilation of the Jews.
See, I feel admittedly, I've watched a lot of cable news, but I feel I've heard a lot about that charter and seen that line quoted many times. You don't think it's come through enough?
No, I think it's something that should be said anytime you are discussing what Hamas wants. And most of the time you hear Hamas wants a ceasefire, Hamas wants a Palestinian state, Hamas wants the blockade in Gaza lifted, Hamas wants its tunnels left alone. Anytime it is omitted that Hamas also wants the annihilation of the Jews and the destruction of Israel, that is an omission that has serious consequences. It has consequences in the political realm. It has global consequences. It's framing the story inaccurately. And again, it creates a false sense of moral equivalency that is not there.
You know, that's one of the I'm sorry, I would like to be polite, but that's one of the most bizarre arguments I've heard. Let me say that if we adopted that line of argumentation, then every single time we mention Benjamin Netanyahu or his coalition partners, we'd have to also include parenthetically what they believe. For example, we'd have to say that in the Likud charter, there is a total claim for the entire land of Israel without Palestinians present in that land of Israel. We'd have to take, for example, the deputy speaker of the Knesset and say that he's called for genocide against Palestinians, total ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip and deporting them to places unknown.
This is part of the founding of Hamas. It continues to be repeated, and to ignore it and treat Hamas just as if it has a set of political demands is not fairly setting the stage for this story.
But the same is true about the story on the Israeli side. The Likud party, while the prime minister...
in the Israeli charter or in the Israeli...
Look at the Likud charter, my dear. Look at the Likud
Israeli charter. It calls for the destruction of all Palestinians.
No, there is no
Israel
Palestine that it mentions. It talks about the... No, actually, they say they want peace, but the Likud party, as opposed to other political parties in Israel, has been very clear about maintaining from the very beginning that there was no Palestinian, legitimate Palestinian or indigenous native presence in that land. They were strangers, they were foreigners, they were to be expelled. The necessary part of the story is what is happening today, what is being done to people today, and that is what I think the press has not adequately covered.
Well, listen, your condescension aside, I'm not suggesting we need to go back thousands of years, but to omit
I'm not saying thousands. The deputy speaker of the Knesset is there now. He was appointed by Prime Minister Netanyahu. He got almost a quarter of the votes in the contest for Likud leader. He is not an insignificant character. When he talks about total genocide...
There is a desire in the media to create a balance in this story between Hamas and Israel. And it's something that we've seen play out, not just in this conflict, but in every time that we discuss these two players. And the balance simply does not exist. It doesn't exist on a number of levels, both practically and existentially. And I don't know if that balance, if the desire to create that balance is motivated by bias or simply a successful Hamas PR strategy, but it's dangerous both for the media and it's dangerous politically.
Let me ask you, James, about something I noticed the other day. Outside CNN in New York on Thursday, there was an anti-Hamas rally that at times also felt like an anti-media rally. I'll put up a picture I took there. One of the posts poster said, "The media fuels terror." And I wondered what that meant. From your perspective, what could that mean, that the media fuels terror?
Even the fact that they've had people on the ground in Gaza has created ire among some supporters of Israel who simply don't want that story told. It's as if there's a parallel universe going on here. Israel wants to devastate Gaza, but they don't want the story told about it.
Let me turn from this topic to Iraq, because by the end of the week, we saw Iraq dominate cable news screens. SC, I wanted to ask you about what you said on Thursday night when President Obama spoke to the country. You said there will be boots on the ground in Iraq. Why do you have that prediction?
Yeah, and I said it over a month ago when we first learned that ISIS was creeping into Iraq and taking Iraq over. Because there just isn't, President Obama has this desire that I think informs all of his foreign policy. And that desire is simply to not be George W. Bush. And he does that until that becomes completely untenable.
Isn't he also reacting to what the American public wants, though? Here's the headline from the Washington Post on Friday: Iraq airstrikes will test a war-weary American public. Every poll seems to show the same thing, that this country has an awful hangover from the Iraq war.
Yeah, but it's the president's job to convey accurately and effectively to the American public and the international community the dangers and urgency. And I think actually he did a great job of this in talking about ISIS and the Yazidis and the humanitarian urgency for at least humanitarian aid and why airstrikes might be necessary. That's his job.
James, I know you've been in touch with U.S. officials about this. What have you heard from them?
Well, I think that they are very aware of the dangers of going forward, and this is a grave step that we're taking, but it's an important step. It's a step that is saving human lives. People stranded on that mountain are facing, a life and death situation. And this ISIS group is a menace. It's not only a menace in Iraq, it's a menace in Syria, and I believe ultimately a menace in the broader region. It's already having reverberations in Lebanon and elsewhere. So the issue is that this has to be done, but it has to be done carefully. It has to be done in a way that can be sustained, and it has to be done in a way that actually takes us from where we are to where we want to be, as opposed to the rather cavalier way we got into the Iraq war in the first place, which was without an end game, without an exit strategy, and without clear goals that were achievable.
James Zogby and SC Cupp, thank you both for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And of course, it is the job of the press to hold this administration accountable and ask the tough questions that need to be asked about this new mission in Iraq. That is, of course, something the press did not do enough of back in 2002 and 2003.